Well, thank you very much, and it's an honor to be here on the 50th anniversary of the Geoscience Forum. Congratulations, and it's great to be in warm Whitehorse. I'm going to use my capital markets lens, being a sell-side analyst for the past 15 years, to look at this question, which I think is kind of provocative: is the Yukon the next Golden Triangle? And there's a confluence of factors that I'm going to walk you through on why that could be the case. But I'm also leveraging experience covering 4 different stocks in the Golden Triangle, and a lot of experience before that, understanding especially the First Nations piece. So let's get right to it. So the outline of the presentation, we're going to talk about the Northern Cordillera Gold-Copper Province and its status. And I got to hand it to Doug Eaton and Matt Turner. I kind of borrowed an idea from them to really frame Alaska, BC, and the Yukon together, because I think that's the way the world does look at it. And then what are the Golden Triangle key success factors? Why has it been so successful in a relatively short period of time, especially the last 10 years? Is the Yukon a proto-Golden Triangle? Can it emulate some of those success factors? And then some key takeaways and the tailwinds potentially for the Yukon. So here is this 400 million ounces, 200 billion pounds of copper between Alaska, Yukon, and BC. We're only showing the northern part of BC, mainly the Golden Triangle. And the largest deposits there with the largest red circles, they're not necessarily mines, but they're plus 25 million ounces gold equivalent. And that's important to know because we're just trying to show value here. So making a gold equivalent works for Pebble and Donlin, which aren't mines, live and good. And you can kind of get a sense of where the important deposits are, throughout BC, the Yukon, and Alaska. So let's look at what I think is quite important for the senior mining companies. They look at this mega province, and they only see 3 mines that are greater than 20 years. Long mine life mines, big deposits, they attract the seniors. So you have Fort Knox and Pogo, both plus 20 years. Those have been fantastic mines for Kinross, Teck Sumitomo, and now Northern Star. And then down in the Panhandle, Greens Creek on Admiralty Island, that's been going for 40 years. A VMS deposit that keeps on giving, which Hecla is operating. Let's look at, up until 2012, what was the senior mining company footprint in this overall province? Again, 400 million ounces of gold, 200 billion pounds of copper. In Alaska, you had a number of seniors. Pebble, there was Anglo-American. You had Barrick at Donlin. Kinross operating the Fort Knox mine, and then Sumitomo and Teck at Pogo. So that was great. Go over to the Yukon, and really isn't any senior mining company involved. Might have been in some sort of exploration program at some stage behind the scenes, but nothing really at the forefront. I'm forgetting in Alaska, you have Hecla down there at Greens Creek. Now look at the Golden Triangle area, and all you have pre-2012 is Barrick with a legacy asset, SK Creek. So that's not in Alaska, that's in BC. Let's fast forward 10 years, and this is the picture now in 2022. It's quite something that, starting with the Golden Triangle in BC, you've had a multitude of seniors come in various forms, whether they be joint ventures, asset purchases, buying mines. Newcrest is the key one. We'll light up which specific transactions have happened. And also look at the Yukon. This is a bit of a game changer in my world because the capital markets, the fund managers will often follow the senior mining companies into new jurisdictions. And then the derivatives, the explorers that are in the same regions that the senior mining companies in will get funded. So it's really important for the Yukon to get that validation. Rio Tinto coming into Casino in terms of investing, Hecla buying into Keynote Hill, and really going to change everything, I think, with their underground mining expertise. And let's go on to the next one. To summarize the impact of what's happened in the last, for BC in the Golden Triangle, since 2018, there's been $4.4 billion worth of M&A. That's incredible. I mean, it's really headlined by the $2.6 billion transaction, Newcrest buying Pretium for Brucejack. You also had about an $800 million transaction when Newcrest bought Red Chris. And that all of a sudden put the Golden Triangle on the world stage, first with Red Chris, because one of the top gold copper miners in the world, Newcrest, saw it as an analog for their Australian Cadia operation. Cadia produces 1 million ounces of gold and copper, sorry, 1 million ounces gold equivalent per year. There's very few mines that produce that much. So a very special situation for Newcrest to come in and have significant success since they came in. We cover Imperial Metals, so we know that story fairly well. You also had GT Gold, which we covered, being bought by Newmont for just under $400 million. These are all US dollars here. Golden Triangle, just for scale on the map there, the long edge of the triangle is about 360 kilometers. Let's move on. And production before 2015, this is my takeaway, surprisingly limited. If you look at pre-2012, we had, again, in gold ounces equivalent, Eskay Creek, fabulous, one of the best mines in the world in terms of grade and ultimately margin, but there was really not very good infrastructure. The cutoff grade at one point at 300 tons per day was 30 grams, if you can believe it. Eventually, it got down to 12 grams. That was the cutoff. And keep in mind, too, that 50% of their operating costs were diesel. Okay, so it was a really important mine for Homestake and Barrick, but it really suffered from margins being eaten away on the access. Premier on the coast there near Stewart, this is a good mine back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, et cetera, but really the best parts of that mine were mined. Lots of jackleg mining and got very, very spectacular grades, head grades out of that mine. Now Ascot, which we cover, is putting that back into production as an underground mine, probably about 6 grams per ton, and that's been permitted and is on its way to becoming a producer, probably in 2024. And finally, the other relatively big mine was the Snip mine. This was one of Kamenko's most profitable mines when we had a bit of a downturn in the markets in the 80s and into the 90s. Amongst all their base metal operations, Snip at about 17 grams per ton in a partnership with Delaware was a fantastic story. So there's been another 1.5 million ounces from a few other players, and again in gold equivalent. And let's just look at what this is in Canada. At the bottom of the chart here, you see on the left-hand side, Timmins producing about 77 million ounces historically, and this doesn't include reserves and resources. And Kirkland Lake next, and then all the way across to sub 10 million ounces for the Golden Triangle. So I was surprised. I thought it might be quite a bit higher than that. So keep that number in mind because we'll come back to it at the end of the presentation. Now, the transformation of the Golden Triangle. How did it get to where it's gotten to with all that prolific M&A, the discoveries and everything? 3 reasons: outstanding geology, First Nations collaboration, which has been really, really important, and then finally new infrastructure between paving of the Stewart-Cassiar Highway, expansion of the Stewart Port, completion of the Northwest Transmission Line, has been key, and there's also been an upgrade recently of the airport at Dease Lake to commercial standards and fiber optic lines coming into the Golden Triangle this year. I would also add that marketing has been really important in terms of profiling the Golden Triangle globally to investors and to senior mining companies. The outreach that the BC Mining Regional Alliance between the Chamber of Mines, provincial government of BC, First Nations were a really, really key part of that. They basically took this show on the road, went to investor conferences, AMBC conference, PDAC, you name it, and all of a sudden the Golden Triangle had a brand, it had greater awareness, and sequentially the senior mining companies were coming in, and so this group started organization probably about 2018 or so, just before Newcrest came in 2019 and bought their piece of red chris. So marketing is really, really important, in my view, of the jurisdiction or the sub-jurisdiction. So why is the Golden Triangle so special? It's got outstanding geology, despite it being in a fairly small, compact area. It's Dickenea terrain, lots of stacked arcs and complicated orientations that have provided the ground prep for fluids to flow up in various forms. We won't get into the gory details. And very importantly, there's something called the red line that you can see on this map that Sue, thank you for doing this, Sue, will show you what that is. The red line is a major unconformity or a break between the Triassic and Jurassic. So it's like the Abitibi with these big breaks, the Cadillac break, the Porcupine-Desser break, or Desser-Porcupine. It's the same type of thing, major, major unconformities. So that's been a real key to the Golden Triangle in terms of the loci of important deposits and mineralization. And to that point, the high, either alkaline or high K porphyries, like red chris, and maybe Sue, you can point to generally where that is, towards the top of the triangle, they exploit that unconformity. They sit in there at about 205 million years. Again, we won't get into the gory details. Precious metal rich VMS, some of the highest grade, grades anywhere in the world. SK Creek, Skeena is now putting that into production. It's at feasibility stage. We estimate production 2025, 2026. That's an open pit, about 4 million ounces of reserves right now. And then epithermal and intrusive related gold, really probably focusing more on Brucejack here. What a game changer for that discovery to be made by Bob Quartermain and his team, taking a non-core asset from Silver Standard and creating all that value, doing a very masterful job on multiple fronts in terms of keeping the capital costs low. And so, it was the asset that ultimately Newcrest they wanted, not only for the mine that peaked at 500,000 ounces per year, which is tier 1 plus, but also for that future exploration potential that they're starting to illuminate to the market. Okay, First Nations collaboration, really, really important in the Golden Triangle. Milestones, probably SK Creek going into production and the Tultan getting comfortable with a small underground mine, getting all sorts of contracts related to that, catering, trucking, you name it. That was really important. And then the Nisga'a Agreement, the top photo on the right, that was a great milestone in the year 2000 for that Great Golden Triangle area. And then the Tultan did an agreement with NovaGold in 2004, and that was transformational in the sense that, and Sue Craig was the architect here, sitting at the front, and had the support of Rick Van Nieuwenhuis at NovaGold. But it changed everything because, in my view, sitting where I was as an analyst and knowing this region fairly well, they were looking at the long-term game, the social license, the emotional license, and constructed an agreement where the Tultan could benefit right from the very beginning and forever, in a sense, as long as that district was being opened up. So talk to Sue more about that, but that was really important in the evolution of the relationships with the Tultan, in my view. Revenue sharing, I've got a slide that will come next. I think it's been a game changer for British Columbia, personally. And then collaboration with IBAs to present. As much as the First Nations certainly want some of the tax base and employment and everything else and stuff like that that comes with it, I think in BC, in the Golden Triangle, they really want to be partners. Ultimately, they want to be partners, not necessarily project equity, but they want to be partners in these operations. And you can see the Tultan branding on the truck at Red Chris as an example of that. The most recent evolution here in 2022 is really the agreements where there's shared decision-making, SDMs. And this is where the Tultan actually have a big say in permitting. It's going to start with Skeena, and there's kind of a co-management aspect to that. Part of that is related to reconciliation, and part of it's related to UNDRIP, because BC has basically brought in UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Principles, And so that's going to be really important in BC for permitting as it goes forward. But it's basically prepared the ground for where we are right now in the Golden Triangle. And it's the BC mineral tax that's shared. I won't spend too much time on this, but there's about 10 million a year, goes to about 17 First Nations. It obviously changes depending on the commodity price. There's a sliding scale. It depends on the claim. For instance, Bruce Jack, the Nisga'a maybe didn't get as big a percentage because it's only the road that gets used by, at that time, Pretium. Red Chris was the first to have an agreement, a revenue sharing agreement in the Golden Triangle, 2015, Bruce Jack 2018, and then we see a couple more coming in. Premier, which should be with the Nisga'a in 2024, and then Eskay, which should be Tahltan in 2025. Interesting that Bruce Jack, the Pretium agreement is actually split between the Tahltan and the Nisga'a. So power infrastructure, when I was on the executive of the BC Yukon Chamber of Mines back in the early 2000s, we advocated with industry that if the transmission line was built up between Terrace to Dease Lake, if that happened, industry would come and find deposits and it would be utilized essentially. And so that was quite an effort. And at first, it didn't happen because the provincial government at the time viewed it as a subsidy. So we had a bit of a false start. We had a lot of momentum. Credit Donald McGuinness for a lot of good work he did. But eventually, it did happen. And the provincial government embraced that if you build it, they will come, that they just had to supply the infrastructure. And for anyone not getting the analogy, everyone loves Kevin Costner, right? From Field of Dreams. Anyway, that's the pitch, and eventually all the senior mining companies and investors come out of the cornfields. At least that was the thesis there. So let's look at it. This new power infrastructure in 2014, $700 million. Originally it was about $250, but it got delayed. So anyway, it's quite a brilliant piece of infrastructure. Took 2.5 years to build. Used to build the Red Chris mine. It was about $40 million for Imperial Metals to actually put the spur in, but they needed it. It wouldn't have been economic to build that open pit without that electrification. So it was a real game changer for Imperial Metals, and they went on to great things by finding big deposits to depth. The run-of-river power sources, which are in this red oval, this was kind of an add-on, and I've got a slide on it, where because the power line was there, Northwest Transmission Line, they were able to add river run-of-flow power to it, which is also good green energy. And finally, is there potential to continue that expansion? Andrew Karn gave a talk yesterday about this would be the natural place to extend up to the Yukon, Watson Lake. Fortunately, I didn't see his presentation because I came in a bit late, but that is the type of thinking that I think has to be on the table and socialized sooner than later. And this is just a slide showing about 175 megawatts from 3 different run-of-flow projects. One is literally 10 kilometers from Skeena's Eskay project, Volcanic Creek, and that will be one of the power sources. So everything's changed in this part of the Golden Triangle in terms of getting that clean, low-cost energy. Interestingly enough, the Tahltan owned 5% of the energy company. They paid $124 million for it, and so they get the dividends and rewards from the energy, which is connected to the Highway 37 grid. So let's talk about the Yukon. The next Golden Triangle, question mark. Anybody think it could be? Okay. We'll ask that question at the very end. So on the geology, it's actually, I'm not going to get into the gory detail, but it's actually impressive that the Yukon Geological Survey and maybe the feds have put a lot of horsepower into the Yukon over the past few decades, whereas in BC it's been a bit in decline. And I would argue in Alaska, there's been a bit of a conflict between the USGS and the state, and they haven't really moved the needle. Plus, add to that that Yukon has a great assessment system, as BC does, so you've got a lot of transparency in terms of previous work. So I'm going to be pretty simplistic here. Some major features: the Selwyn Basin, Tintina Gold Belt, best efforts based on some new discoveries and things that have been happening. And then the next one is a couple of development projects. Probably should have put Kitsakaya on here as well in terms of those red dots. And then quite a few projects that are emerging either with new discoveries or are going to benefit from maybe the critical minerals initiatives and things like that. So there's a lot happening in the Yukon. And now we'll go forward. And so I would argue the Yukon is right now on fire. I don't think the capital markets really appreciate it. Maybe some people in this room do, but there's been a lot of things that have happened that I think have given the Yukon a stamp of approval. Victoria Gold building a heap leach mine in the Yukon, fantastic. 200,000 ounces per year. There's very, very few mines coming on stream with that type of scale. So that's a huge win for the Yukon, and in terms of one of the three mines producing, and I include Keno Hill as producing. Hecla coming in, bringing to bear their expertise, underground mining. I think that's huge. It's a look-alike, according to Hecla, on some level of another Lucky Friday, so they know the beast. Minto pivoting to exploration is fantastic after not exploring for years. And then, I think Western Copper and Gold, getting Rio in with that strategic investment is a massive validation. Kind of puts it on the map, Casino on the map, as a globally important and very strategic asset, copper, moly, gold, and we'll come back to that at the very end. And then Snowline Gold, congratulations, Ron and Scott and team. This is an amazing discovery. I call it Fort Knox on steroids. 300 meters at 2.5 grams, 100 meters of 4 grams. It's globally very significant. So I couldn't wait to get that one up in coverage once I got up to site in August. And I've never said this before in a presentation, but Jim Bob Moffat, anytime he got excited, said, "Hot damn!" So that is where I'm going with that discovery. So from my 17 years of experience, albeit a little bit remote, it is a fantastic discovery. Banyan, Tara and her team growing a deposit that really came from nowhere in my view, up to 4 million ounces and growing. Fantastic. That's another really important data point, especially with their fantastic infrastructure in proximity to Eagle. And then at the bottom, fireweed, critical minerals. It's got to be one of the top projects in the Yukon that is really key for the Yukon, because I think the Yukon's going to have its ability to say what its top projects are when the federal government starts to carve out money on a province-by-province basis. So I think Brandon's in a good position there. We have a slide at the very end that speaks to this as well. I'm not going to go at length on the Yukon First Nations. To be honest, I'm still going learning curve to some extent, but I'm seeing a lot of the elements that are preparing the ground for a lot of progress to be made with the mining companies. Certainly having the definitive agreements with 11 of the 14 is really important. The fact there's an agreement related to a mining memorandum of understanding for revenues to be going to the First Nations, the changes that are coming in the Quartz Mining Act, the existing royalty that's there, Selkirk having a royalty on the Minto mine. Probably the one thing everyone wants to see, the hurry-up offense on the land use planning. I think First Nations included, and I'm sure as that can get driven forward, that'll be another big tick mark for the Yukon. BC went through it. It took some time, it took some effort, but it was definitely worth it at the end of the day to get that certainty. So, has anybody seen this book, The Future's Now? This is Bob McDonald's book that just came out this year. He's the science guy on CBC. It is fantastic, all about energy and what's happening. It's kind of a forward look on energy, but at the same time, he's basically saying we've got all the solutions right now. We just have to apply them. So it's the gap in the Yukon. It's that sometimes the elephant in the room, I guess. But in terms of the lack of power, and I probably should put hydrogen on the list, given Sean mentioned that, electrifying the Yukon vis-a-vis the BC grid that's certainly an option, a couple $1 billion there. The book certainly goes into small modular nuclear power, which I think would be fantastic. 100 megawatts of power from a modular nuclear unit the size of a semi-truck, right? Get them to site, relatively safe. You go into the book to see a lot of the details on that. I think that'd be a game changer. LNG may have its role in the Yukon, and then components of solar and wind. I think it would be very incremental. I was impressed that Snowline, for example, had their camp run by solar all summer. That was fantastic to see. Then transportation infrastructure. I know there's a lot of funds that have been earmarked as part of the government industry collaboration with that Gateway program. I need to drill down on that a little bit more, but certainly the canal and casino roads are two of the projects that really benefit from that. And finally, the critical minerals funding. My understanding is that in that $3.8 billion, aside from the provinces all getting their say to some extent, there's going to be three buckets. One will be infrastructure, which is good for the Yukon. One will be project specific, and so probably, hopefully, the best of breed projects get funded. And then there's going to be another piece that is funding expediting the permitting process, which I think is music to most people's ears. And that'll be related to First Nations engagement. So that's a key thing, a key outcome, I think, of this soon-to-be deployed $3.8 billion by the federal government. And here's some of the metals, certainly in the Yukon, that will be embraced, I would like to think. So Yukon Momentum, as I say, I think it's kind of on fire. First Nations increasing collaboration, to some extent maybe stealing a couple of pages from the BC book, I think it'd be very important. Critical Metals Initiative, funding from both the Canadian government and the US federal government. Everyone's probably seen that the US Department of Military is now looking forward northward for projects to fund. And I put up this map from Natural Resources Canada because it's got basically 9 red domains across the country that are earmarked for critical minerals. So they've obviously done a bit of screening and like these areas, and notably 2 are in the Yukon. So I think that's very positive for the Yukon securing their share of this critical minerals funding pie. Senior mining companies, validation and capital. It is really important that the Yukon has secured as many senior mining companies as it has, whether they be in joint ventures, strategic investments, or buying into mines. So I would be welcoming any senior mining company, base metal, precious metal, diversified, to come up and learn more about the Yukon. And I think investors on the same note. Infrastructure, build it and they will come. I think, it worked for BC. It took a long time, but I think a lot of the planets are aligning for that type of thinking, again, vis-a-vis the critical metals initiative. Commodity prices, maybe not in the short term, but I think in the second half of next year, as we see inflation come down, and as we see maybe a recession pass, if that's the case, and we see interest rates, the velocity of the increases slow down and maybe even stop, I think you're going to see a really nice bounce in the precious metal prices, specifically gold, and I think we'll get back onto maybe a copper trade in particular. And finally, marketing by the Yukon government, I think it's going to be a really important part of this equation. It's that international thrust to investors in Europe and New York and London and Australia. The Aussies have already come over and said, we love the Golden Triangle. They've invested in it in terms of Newcrest. And we love Alaska. We bought into Pogo. They have all sorts of junior mining companies in Alaska, but for some reason they're not there in the Yukon. So I would be rolling out the red carpet to the Aussies, the seniors, the juniors, you name it, because they're very good explorers. Not that we aren't, but they have different techniques and structures. I would also mention it was really good to see Minister Pillay down in Beaver Creek at the #1 institutional mining conference, in my view, last September, and the only minister-level official that came. He came and spoke at our reception, and the interesting thing for me was Usually you don't have a government official like that. We had a room of 120 people, and when he spoke, you could hear a pin drop. Everybody was hanging on to his words because the Yukon has some momentum. There's a lot of interest in where's the Yukon going. So that message from him really resonated well. And in my experience with the Chamber of Mines, you just don't get politicians coming out to events like that enough. So I think that moved the needle with the international fund managers and companies that were there. So is the Yukon the next Golden Triangle? I like this. My associates built this slide. I was a little bit surprised, but Sue can maybe circle the Golden Triangle side of things. Pre-2012, you've got 9.3 million ounces produced. And then if you only look at the reserves, for the next 40 years, it looks like the Golden Triangle will produce just under 32 million ounces. So that's Red Chris, Brucejack, Eskay, and Premier, not including anything else, not including Seabridge, even though it's permitted. And then on the right-hand side, look at the Yukon gold equivalent production. Not very much, not including Placer, before 2012, but look at the next 40 years. If these projects, other Eagle in production, great, Keno Hill in production, Minto, but if Casino comes along and Coffee comes along, it could match what the Golden Triangle is going to produce. Obviously, this is contingent on infrastructure and a lot of things coming into play, especially for Casino. But that's a really impressive takeaway, and it's back to the build it and they will come, I think. So I think this is probably the last slide and probably going to animate the Mac Pass and Rogue, a few new highlights here. But just coming back to the Golden Triangle in context with this greater North American copper gold province. Alaska, Yukon, and BC, 400 million ounces of gold in resources, which is impressive, I think, at 200 billion pounds of copper. And the fact that that fairly compact area in the Golden Triangle, in a very, very short period of time, let's call it 10 years, was able to get onto the world stage. Every major fund manager now knows what the Golden Triangle is. Every resource investor, no matter where they are in the world, knows about the Golden Triangle. I think the same can happen for the Yukon. Yukon's got this opportunity vis-a-vis some of the things we've talked about, senior mining companies present, the critical metals funds coming in, maybe a commodity, a little bit of a tailwind on the commodities wouldn't hurt either, to help the juniors capitalize, because it's a very tough financing market for them. That's the last slide. Thanks for your attention.